if the Conservative Party wants to undo the untold damage done to their brand amongst Brexiteers over the last year, they need to change leadership. They need to move on. They need to get a new top team, and a team who understands what that result meant, who believes in that result, who voted for that result, and who can deliver it. I think this all ends in an election. That's clearly the sort of end game here, and it can't be avoided, no matter how much the Labour Party want to kick the can down the road, to use that phrase that we all hate using so much. But what is quite clear, and I think what a lot of people have been missing really about the Number 10 strategy, is it's not talking to sort of the SW1 bubble. It's not talking to Westminster. It's talking to the wider country. And if we look at if we take a step back from the political fray and the mayhem and all the nonsense that's been going on in Parliament, actually the Conservative Party has been building a pretty steady lead above the other parties. And so when that election does come, it will be a pretty seismic clear out of Parliament. It clearly has been the intention through this whole time. It still is the intention of, it's most likely that Boris Johnson will become the Prime Minister in 6 days' time. It's his absolute intention to get a deal. And if the EU are going to be sensible about this, we will get a deal. But it's also right that if the EU do not budge, they will be putting us in a really horrible situation as a country. We don't want to leave with no deal, but it has to be on the table. Well, it's proper to prepare for it, and it's right that we do so if the EU do not grant a single concession. And the Labour Party will try very hard to cancel the votes of millions of people up and down this country, but ultimately they will fail. Ultimately, that's how you fix this rut. The rut has been created by a Parliament that has gone back on its promises, a Parliament that is so finely balanced that all votes are almost unwinnable. We always get this sort of sense of crisis when there's a hung Parliament, when no one can command a clear majority in Parliament. That's when political chaos arises. It's not so much to do with the Brexit situation, which of course would be sorted if Boris Johnson had a thumping majority. We all know that. So let's stop pretending that the issue here is some sort of intractable Brexit quagmire. It's a parliamentary quagmire. And by removing those barnacles from the boat, if you like, by removing those people who were going back on the Conservative manifesto commitments that they signed up in order to keep no deal on the table, in order to get that good deal that we all want to see at the end of October, by removing those people from the party who actually in effect voted no confidence in their government in the same way that John Major removed rebels from his party, that has made the party more united in Parliament, smaller in Parliament, but more united, and that puts it in a stronger stead for a general election. And you talk about the threat from the Brexit Party. It's clear that threat diminishes if the party is united and strong on its core message of leaving the European Union. So this move this week is making it more likely that the Conservative Party will do well in an election, and that's why the opposition don't want to see one. What Remainers are trying to do in Parliament is find any excuse to not have an election, because they know they would lose. Boris Johnson has, depending on which pollster you look at, between a 9 and 11 point lead above the Labour Party. It looks like if we were going to have a general election anytime soon, the Conservatives would come in with a thumping majority. And that's really what Remainers don't want to see. They don't want to subject their points to the electorate. So Boris Johnson has said that he'd keep almost everything on the table in terms of dealing with Parliament, in the same way that Remainers in Parliament have made unprecedented moves, going against history and precedent in order to get their point across. Jeremy Hunt has taken some crucial tactics off the table, meaning it will be harder for him to deal with Parliament, harder for him to get through his policy agenda. So Boris is really miles ahead in this front in terms of keeping crucial tactics on the table.
I think some of those crucial tactics that Tom is talking about is the proroguing of Parliament, which would be absolutely unprecedented, completely undemocratic.
Lots before.
No, that's not.
Ultimately, what everyone wants now is a general election, because this Parliament is so rotten and it's so far away from the promises on which it stood at the last election. It's right that that's refreshed, and ultimately that will happen in a matter of weeks or months. It's unlikely that this will stretch on beyond Christmas. So if Parliament find a way to get an extension, I still think that's less likely than likely, but if they find a way to get an extension through, then ultimately there's going to be an election. Boris Johnson has an 11-point lead in the polls in the most recent poll, and it is likely that a Tory majority would be determined. We'd find ourselves exactly where we are now, and we'd leave with this deal, because the EU would know that we'd be leaving with no deal if it didn't. What would be really, really sad is if the EU's intransigence over the backstop is what delivers no deal and offers some of those bumps in the road that the EU is saying that the backstop is trying to avoid. It's an entirely ironic device in that sense. If it's trying to avoid a hard border, but is the thing that actually stops a deal being able to be reached, then clearly that's a political game that the EU is playing. There is not a deal that includes the backstop that can pass through Parliament. If the European Union wants a deal, which it does, if the UK wants a deal, which it does, then the European Union will have to move. And their intransigence is really quite sad and political. And it's clear that they're not acting in the interests of the people of Europe, and it's about time that they should. I think it's still more likely that we're going to leave with a deal than without one, simply because we have this credible path to pursue in terms of leaving on WTO terms at the end of October. Well, Boris has been very clear that no deal should always be on the table. It's not the outcome that he wants for the country. He wants to get a good deal. But the way that you get a good deal isn't to put away no deal, isn't to say that we're taking no deal off the table. How would you bargain for a better deal if you do that? So it's quite a pragmatic approach that he's taking. He's going to go back to Brussels and try and get those concessions that some argue Theresa May didn't even ask for. We're going to have a much more positive negotiating stance if Boris gets through. Well, it's only a 1 in a million chance if we prepare for it. Now, that might sound counterintuitive, but it's only that we will get a deal that's different from Theresa May's deal, that doesn't have the anti-democratic backstop in it, that's something that can pass through Parliament if we prepare for no deal. It's basic negotiation strategy. They're making clear that the purpose of Brexit is regulatory divergence, and they appreciate negotiating with something firmer like that than something that's saying, oh, we could do anything after this. Boris wins. We attempt a renegotiation with Europe. Initially, they say no, but because we're leaving no deal on the table as that credible threat, eventually, at the last possible minute, some concessions are granted, particularly around the Irish backstop. And that leads to a new deal being presented to Parliament. Actually, Boris achieves a new deal. The EU knows he's serious about no deal, knows the only way to avert it is to get a deal that's credibly going to pass through Parliament. So that's proposed by the EU. Governing becomes almost impossible. He calls a general election and delivers the first decent Tory majority since 1987. It's right that this comes to a conclusion. It's right that we get Brexit done. And in order for that to happen, the EU are going to have to move. The Prime Minister has made an incredibly generous, open, big, comprehensive offer to them in the form of this new deal. And actually, we haven't heard the sort of scathing response that Theresa May, for example, heard back at the Salzburg summit last year. There is tentative positive feeling towards this, and I think it really hangs in the balance. Unfortunately, the way that Parliament has acted and the passage of things such as the Surrender Act make it a lot harder to get that deal done, because many in the EU don't believe that the UK government can now leave with no deal at the end of the month. I think the government's determined to prove them wrong, and it's really touch and go as to whether they accept this, but everything remains on the table, and I'm, for one, feeling quite positive about the lack of sort of a big, obstinate response, such as we heard with Theresa May. Ironically, Boris Johnson, who'd have thought it, he's turned out to be much more of a diplomat in the way that he has proposed this new deal than Theresa May ever was. We have these opportunities. If we leave the customs union, if we leave the single market, we can put Brexit to bed. We can get past this horrible situation we've been stuck in, this merry-go-round that we've been sitting on, these same discussions that we've been having week after week, month after month, year after year. We need to end this. We need to leave, whether it be on no deal or a loose arrangement, ideally a Canada-style deal, and then we can move on to the real issues that face people day to day. It's a Brexit-themed premiership. It's talking to those more forgotten communities, those communities that politicians don't often focus on, talking to the places that voted leave and the communities up, especially in the north of England. And I think that that's somewhere that the Conservatives are really going to focus on. I think this is going to open him up to exactly the same questions as before. This is someone who is vying to lead the country, and yet on the biggest issue of the day, he doesn't have a position. He can't lead people anywhere because he doesn't know what his own mind is. Because Parliament can change the law with just simple majorities, supermajorities don't really work if you propose new legislation. So he could propose a new election under a simple majority like that, and that's much more likely to pass. I think it would be really quite silly of any member of Parliament to say, I'm going to refuse an election at the risk of one happening, I think that would be a hard case to go back to their electorate and say, oh, I didn't want you to vote because I knew that I might lose, or anything like that. That really takes a lot of the wind out of their sails. So I think just in basic logic terms, they're likely to vote for an election.
I'm sure he adores your optimism.
I'm perpetually optimistic. How can you not be? I mean, otherwise you'd be in a profoundly miserable state in times like these. But if that vote does go against the government, then we're heading for election territory. There were these same sort of conversations going on in the 1980s that, oh, all Conservatives are far too old, how are they ever going to get back into government again? There's a general election and a stonking Tory majority.
And you live happily ever after.